Hello everyone, welcome to... Hello everyone, welcome to Longarming by Jaclyn. Last time we sort of talked a lot about contrast and ways to increase the contrast in your quilts and why you would use contrast in your quilt design. Basically, if you're relying on the seams of the piecing to tell the story of your quilt, you need a lot of contrast at those seams so your eyeball can see them. So now we're going to talk about the other side of the coin and talk about ways to use low contrast fabrics and how those can be used in your quilts. So I have a quilt that I am going to be designing, and I was told that the couple likes lots of different various shades of blue. I have put in some feelers as to what exactly that means to see if I can get some clarity and sort of shape my idea a little bit more, but I did, for inspiration, start gathering some scrappy blue scraps, and these are, is this a fat quarter? And I think I might have a few. This is a yard. This is a yard, but it's a 108, so there's a lot of this one. Another fat quarter. A lot of, I have gone in and pillaged a bunch of 2.5-inch strip rolls and pulled out some of the blues. These I thought might add sort of a pop of color. There's a great deal of blue in there, but obviously some other colors. We'll see. This might be in, this might be out. And various blues. And then I think this might be a 1.5 yards. I'm gonna have to unfold this and measure it. This is more of a traditional floral. This was my, you'll remember from the contrast video, I talked a lot about these bigger hero prints with a lot of colors going on. So depending on the piece size, if I am too small, this will not read as a blue, but if I'm going soft and chaotic anyways, it's less important that I have a clear line. So as I'm designing this quilt, and I do have a few solids, some yardage of some solids in there that are lighter than this electric blue. They're more tones out of this family, maybe a little bit of a tealer, greener hint to them, but they're more in this vibe. Solids in this palette here. Ooh, that looks dark on camera. This is much lighter in real life. Anyways. So this is kind of the palette that I'm sort of starting to assemble. So things that you will create with non-contrasting fabrics is sort of overall texture, movement, and maybe chaos. And there's some great ways to use that. So let's talk about a crumb quilt or a crazy quilt. A lot of people know what that is. Maybe I can find an example. Hopefully. And that has gone into complete chaos. So there's no set amount or rule of contrast between the pieces. You're not really using the seams to like create little shapes that tell a story. I'm not trying to see a pinwheel in that, but it's a lot of movement. So there is high and low contrast. It's sort of disorganized contrast. Some high, some low, all over the place. So non-contrasting fabrics or not strictly contrasting fabrics can create chaos, which is a lot of energy. It's very vibrant. It's kind of interesting and improvisational how things just happen. So if you're interested in a chaotic quilt, which can be very beautiful and very interesting and sort of artful, choosing fabrics that don't necessarily contrast can keep that from being too jarring and just give it an all-over sense of lots of things going on, sort of the energy of a beehive buzzing. So this color palette is lower contrast. I mean, plenty of these fabrics have contrast in between them. This is maybe less, a softer contrast. That's a pretty decent amount of contrast. but I am sort of creating, think of like an ocean or a lake, and it's just sort of shimmering, and you see a little bit of wave activity and you see a little bit of movement. It's not all homogeneous and uniform, but you do see some texture and some movement going on. And the piecing isn't making rigid, crisp, graphic shapes. I'm not trying to get a pinwheel to pop out of this, but I'm just trying to get something going on more than just one piece of fabric. Make it a little more custom, a little more interesting. But I'm going for texture, color, movement, and not really shapes. So I don't need that clear distinction at a seam line to tell the story of the quilt. So one of my favorite examples is a jelly roll race style quilt. And those look great, either totally scrappy with that random and chaotic level of contrast, some a lot, some a little. I'm not really using the piecing to create shapes that I need to see from a distance. And it also looks good on a tone on tone, where you take a lot of fabrics that are similar, low contrast to each other, and just let them blend and roll one into the other. So low contrast is also good for creating a gradient. That's another place that is very beautiful that you would use low contrast fabrics. So I guess the crumb quilt is random fabrics, random amounts of contrast, so you're going into chaos. And then you can have low contrast, but not chaotic, not necessarily improvisational. And so there you have blending and gentle movement and that sort of thing. So if you are not relying on your seams to make a shape that's telling a very specific story for you, and you're not trying to bring that out, then you soften that by going into lower contrast fabrics. And I will caution you again about the big hero prints. So even though this fabric might not have a strong contrast to the fabric next to it, there could be strong contrasts within. So if I'm using a big piece of this, these dark shapes are gonna pop out. So if you don't want to see a lot of contrast and sharp edges in your quilt, but you use a fabric that has contrast and sharp edges within it, you're not creating that contrast between two pieces of fabric, but you do still have it. So that's something to think about in your fabric design as you're selecting fabrics for your quilt, as you're choosing the pattern for your quilt. And I think we're going to do a video on my top 5 ways to use these complicated multicolor large scale hero prints and use them in a way that is successful. I don't want people to think I'm against these. I do think you should buy a fat quarter of this, and you should buy yards and yards of a fabric more like this, because a fabric like this that's a little bit more restrained to a certain color palette, a certain saturation, is much easier to use in a quilt than something that's all over the place. So when we say low contrast and we say it softens the quilt, I think a lot of people think it's going to be desaturated. And you can have a very saturated quilt and not a lot of contrast. So this is an extremely saturated blue. This is a very saturated blue. But between the two of them, it's a soft amount of contrast. And I don't know if this is gonna... So all very saturated blue fabrics, I would say maybe 1, 2, 3 on the saturation scale. I don't know if I would use these together if I weren't going for a more chaotic look. But if I combine these, my story is going to be about undulating blues, whether they're saturated and deep undulating blues, or whether I'm telling a story about sort of softer and desaturated undulating blues. But I'm not going to make a pinwheel out of this and put it on this and have it be the dominant thing that your eye and brain is going to pick up from that. I'm going to get gentle movement or gentle gradient. So I don't know where this quilt is going yet, and I guess we shall see where it's headed. But I did finish the Random Fabric Challenge quilt, I don't think I was in the size requirements, which was supposed to be within 50 by 60. So it was 50 to 60 by 50 to 60, somewhere in there. I think I was like 62 all around or something like that. But let's take a look at that. So let's start from far away. Obviously you see the star, and I created that with high contrast, pairing these darker outer bands of the star against the stark white background. And then we see a gradient. So you can pick up the gradient. You kind of see that there's layers and stripes to that star. So you kind of get the idea that there's layers and it's gradiating from dark to light. And of course I put a dark center. So between each band, there is some contrast, but certainly less than between the background and that first band. So I wanted a graphic edge to the star, so I put the dark on the outside. I wanted it to gradiate and blend toward the middle, so each layer has a little bit, a softer contrast between the two layers. And then within each group, going around the star, I wanted to de-emphasize the seams as much as possible. So I'm just creating sort of general movement within the theme, which was dark, medium, and light. So there's a little something going on. There's a little texture, but I'm not trying to make a shape inside the bands of that star that's really going to read strongly. A while ago, I filmed the talking portion of our show, working with kind of a series we did, how to create contrast and how to select fabrics for contrast in your quilts so that your piecing shows. And then I did an episode on working with large scale multicolor hero prints, which are difficult fabrics to deploy in a quilt and have them look right because they're difficult to contrast to anything. So now we are on to the segment on low contrast fabrics. So you can successfully pair multiple fabrics that do not have a lot of contrast in them between each other, but you have to select your quilt design features around this idea that you're working in a low contrast mindset and mentality. So if you want your piecing to pop, you have to have contrast. So this is not going to be really a piecing story. And if you are stressed out about your points, you're not going to see your points anyways. So starting with a low contrast selection of fabrics is a great way. Maybe you're using this as a playground to practice new piecing skills that you haven't tried before because you're afraid of that really graphic high contrast, like look at my points, and you think, what if they're not great? So it's a good place to experiment with that because you're not going to see those points anyways. So do it, don't do it, try it, practice. I'm a big advocate of experimenting, sampling, and playing. So this is going to be more tonal, more textural, and you're gonna see maybe movement. It's gonna be a story more about the colors and the textures that are created. It's really not a place to stress out and spend a lot of time on elaborate or ornate piecing that needs to be able to see those seams for the image to jump off and show themselves to you, because you're not going to see it. So texture, movement, color, yes. Graphic shapes, no. You're not going to see those in a low contrast quilt. So you're going to choose something that doesn't matter. Some of these quilts are great. They can be really fast. I would point to a jelly roll race style of quilt. You can combine a lot of different fabrics and there's not really a shape being made with that. You can do quilts that tell a story that's more of a wash. So if you have maybe there is a shape, but it's going to sort of wash gently from one into the other. You're going to have a lot of blending. So the specific pinpoint location of those seams is less important because you're not going to see it. And then your quilting might be sort of more all over bigger stories on that because your piecing is not precise, pinpoint, graphic, strong, bold lines. You're not going to get any of that. So don't stress out about making hard shapes because you're not going to see those hard shapes. You might not want to do a million teeny tiny 1.5 half square triangles because nobody's going to see that work that you put into it. So they can be really fast, they can be really fun, they can have a lot of movement, they can look really beautiful in a room because they're not competing with every other element in the room. They're sort of staying in their own lane. They're sort of gentler, more blendy, more washy. So if you just want like a little blue moment to accessorize your brown couch in a beige room because you're a renter, you don't have to put every color from the whole room in that quilt. You don't have to make strong graphic shapes in that quilt. So we already did the strong graphic shapes video and how to make strong graphic shapes out of not really strong graphic fabrics. So now we're going to show the other end of the spectrum. So this request was done for, the statement was all kind of blues. And I'm struggling a little bit to put a pin on what exactly that does and doesn't mean. But we're going to try today to make a design from all kinds of blues. So necessarily because we have a lot of the same color, it's going to be lower contrast. And let's see what we can come up with today. I have 2 yards of this fabric and it's got, it's pretty gender neutral. A lot of quilting fabrics are so girly and so kind of infantilized that finding something that is gender neutral and works well for men and older boys and just people who aren't so frilly can be hard to find. So I really like this one. This is an excellent fabric because it, like a solid, this is woven. So it's not two-sided, but you can see that these little arrows, this is not a print, this is actually woven in. If it weren't for the arrows, it would be a two-sided fabric. So this is a really nice, interesting, high quality fabric. It's got a lovely texture to it. It's a little bit coarser in the way that a linen would be. Textile Creations Trail. And I just love it. And I haven't found a home for it yet. So I think this is going to be my main base fabric for this quilt. This is for a couple who got married, and I am friends of the family on the husband's side. So I don't want it to be like too girly where it's kind of all about her. I want it to be a little more neutral where they can both enjoy it in the home and he doesn't feel like, oh, I'm covered in lace and diamonds. Ah. So we're gonna go with that. Okay, so color wash quilts are kind of an interesting idea. And you can arrange a bargello to have less contrast and sort of flow through the colors. So I'm going to do a little organizing and working with my palette. I pulled out all the fabrics that might go in, and now I'm going to refine my choices. And unless I really need it, these sort of batik-y, this is maybe more teal than I'm going. So let's pull these out for now. They might be back in later. And then like these little batikis, there's blue in there, but also a lot of other colors. So maybe for now at least, we'll edit these out. They could come back. This is pretty strong and graphic, but I do have some other strong blues. So we'll leave this in for now. What else do we have in here? I'm feeling like this is too heavy in the pinks. Maybe this one can stay. Maybe this is more of a pink story, so we're getting that out. Again, subject to further editing. We're getting pretty green with this guy. Let's pull him out. He's a no. What else? What else? What else? I am including in my background I'm gonna put some grays, and I have a yard in here. I've got some solids. I've got some backgroundy. This is sort of a textural gray. This is a solid gray, and I have another print gray in here somewhere. Where did I put him? So I am incorporating a little bit of gray so it doesn't become too one note on the blue. It could get a little heavy. And this is actually teal. This is a little bit greeny. And there's other shades going on, but I think this will add some interest and texture. So we're going to keep my little elk flower hat elks in. I've got some real deep ones. We're going toward navy in some of these. This, I just have these long skinny. I'm going to be really careful how I use this because I don't have much of it left. Some anchors, I think maybe this one, maybe not this one. Okay, so I think the first thing I'm going to do is maybe organize these from light to dark and see if that gives me some inspiration for a wash color palette. I did add this fabric. I have also a lot of this. It's a really nice texture. This is kind of a, I don't know what it is, but it feels like raw silk, and it has this sort of moire pattern to it. It reads very gray. It's a very cool blue. There's no green at all. It's kind of leaning toward gray. And I think this is my color assortment if I wanted to do sort of a wash. And if you do small pieces of fabric, the story and the print of each individual fabric is minimized. If you do large pieces of fabric, you're gonna allow the print and texture of that individual fabric to show up more. So you kind of have to decide, are there fabrics that you want it to be about the fabric and put a bigger real estate of that? Or do you want to leave it this undulating wash and diminish and play down the individual fabrics? Like this little feather looking one, I brought that in for the color of it, not necessarily for the print of it. So I might minimize that one and keep it in small chunks. And then also as you're blending, smaller chunks allows it to flow one fabric into the next more softly and more smoothly than sort of bigger chunks. It's going to give me more of a gradient with an easy, smooth transition. So if what I'm going for is a blendy wash, I'm going to tend to use smaller pieces of fabric and allow them to flow one into the other. So looking at the size and shape of the fabric, this is a stashy quilt. All of this stuff is stuff that I owned. Some of it is true scraps that have come off of other projects. A lot of this is long and skinny. I've got some jelly roll style 2.5 inch pre-cut strips in here. So I think what I'm going to do is lean into that shape and create basically 2.5 inch strips and then cut those blocks so that it's on point. So it's like a diamond with the strips going across diagonally corner to corner. And then I'll arrange these blocks moving across the quilt so that it forms a color wash. And I think that's what I've come up with for this quilt. And I have a lot of, I think these softer colors, I have a lot of them. They might be more successful. So I might go, I could go from the outside in. I could go light, dark, light. I could go just light to dark. I'm gonna have to give some thought about the blocks that I create. And I've got a 12.5 inch ruler. So I think the base block is going to be like a 12.5 inch square on point. Now I have to think about, do I want to set those in setting triangles? Something like this. So my stripy fabric would be going this way, basically creating a gentle wash of stripes out of my different fabrics. And setting triangles would be like this. So I'd have my on point block, and then it would be set in triangles on the corners to make that a square. Do I want to sash that? Do I want to just go block to block up against each other? Let's give that some thought. So I have this bolt of cream, and this dark blue I have quite a bit of, and this moire fabric I have quite a bit of. So what I could do is like a reverse wash. Maybe I'll do my dark stripy units and set those in a cream. Is this cream and this gray gonna go? We're starting to get a little bit of a temperature mismatch. This cream is gonna soften it, but is it too warm? I think it's okay. It's not reading as super yellowy. This is kind of more of a neutral muslin tone. It's not too yellowy, so I think this will be okay. So maybe I'll set my darkest stripe units in cream. Maybe I'll set my lightest ones in the dark color and my medium ones in the medium. So while my set of stripey blocks is washing dark to light, my setting blocks might be washing light to dark. Is that too chaotic? Let's reverse it. Let's set the lights in light. Let's set the mediums in mediums and the darks in darks. And that way my wash direction is one direction and I don't have too much crisscrossing contrast going on. So let's do that. The lightest fabrics will be set in this. The darkest fabrics will be set in, this might not even be dark enough. We'll see. We'll see. All right, I think I've got it. So after deciding that a 12 by 14 unit gives me an aspect ratio for the whole quilt that I'm happy with, I started doing some sketching and I kind of came up with this idea. So each row of these is going to be like a stripe, and I think I'm going to do the darkest fabrics in this middle stripe and then get lighter as I go out. So you'll have like very soft on the outsides. That's what I'll do. I kind of like this hourglass design, and as you move towards the middle, you start to see the stripe of background color taking dominance over these little blendy stripey situations in here. If I want my outer block to trim up to about 12.5 raw before it goes into the quilt and finish at 12, this inner block is going to need to be around 6. I think I want them to float a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about these setting triangles. It's easy to start from the inner size and figure out what your outer size is going to be. So whatever is your inner square size, your neck square size, if you're doing the 2 square method, cut this square the same size as this square, but cut 2 of these. And then you'll cut them in half, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and have a little bit of room for trimming. It's not exact, but it gives you a little buffer for trimming. If you want this point to be exactly on the seam, you want to trim 1/4 of an inch away from the point for your raw block. And then when you sew them together with your 1/4 inch seam, the point from this block next door and this block will kiss. I like mine to float a little bit. So if I want this finished block width in the quilt, so sewn in, to be 12 inches, but I want it to float a little bit. So I don't want this to be 12. I want this to be more like 11.5. I could go smaller. So this is my right triangle here.
this squared plus this squared equals this squared. And I decided I wanted this to be 11.5 inches. So I just calculate these are the same. This squared divided by 2 square rooted is going to give me this. And it works out to be right about 7 3/4 inches. So if I do a 7 3/4 inch inner square on point, that will then be set in a 7 3/4. You could do 8. You'll just have more wiggle room to trim. So the background will be 2, let's call it 8-inch squares. That'll give me my setting triangles. And I can trim that down to my 12.5-inch raw block, which shows up as 12 inches sewn in the quilt after I lose my little seam allowances. I do like these to float a little bit. Number one, you got a lot of seam allowance there, and because I'm doing a scrappy sort of improv block, I could have a seam right here, plus this seam, plus all these seams. It could just get a little with seam allowance. So I shrank this number down a little bit. So that's how you can figure out what you want your inner block to be on this size based on the outer block. Going the other way is very easy. Whatever size is inner block, the outer block is the same size, and you make 2. There's also a make 1 method where you need a bigger triangle of setting material and you cut it in quarters. So I'm just taking my setting triangle, cutting it in half. I have a triangle, and then I do another one, and that gives me my 4 setting triangles. You can do a method where you cut one and you cut it like that, but the math is more complicated and you need a bigger square to start with, which is to me not as useful, especially when you're sewing stashy and you got what you got. You may not have a big old honkin' square, and that inner square gets big fast. This is gonna be easier to make, in my opinion. So that's how I did the math. This is basic. You learn this in middle school. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. A and B are the same because it's a right triangle, an equilateral right triangle, whatever. I guess isosceles is the word. So that makes it real easy.
This seems really complicated, but all I did was decide my arrangement and placement of fabrics for the background. For each square in each column, I need 1 setting square here and 1 setting square here. And in some of those, it's going to be a setting square is going to be in one stripe, and the other setting square is going to come from the other stripe. So I counted up how many setting squares I need of each color to make my columns, and on top, these color groups for these columns and these mid columns are, I'm going to group my fabrics into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So lightest to darkest. I'm going to put them in little subgroups, and how many on point little strippy doodads am I going to cut from each of those. These numbers include 1 and 1 because these stripes are going to be the same color, all the way to 6, which is the center, so there's just one of those. It seems complicated, but it's just drawing, counting, thinking it through. These little areas here are going to have basically setting strips of just whatever is the background color for that stripe to fill in the gap there. So it's more drawing and counting. Math is not hard. You got this, girl. I went and pulled some more fabrics, and there can be some sharing between 2 groups to increase the smooth gradient. I will probably be using like the darkest color from one group in the next group, so there's a little bit more of a smooth transition. So this is my super light, medium light, light medium, dark medium, medium darks, and fully darks. And they're going to be a little bit scrappy because I don't have every fabric enough for every block. So the next thing I'm going to do is, because I'm using these pre-cuts, I'm sort of stuck with 2.5 inches. So I am going to do some starching and pressing and cutting of some 2.5 inch strips. Then I think what I'll do is try to assemble a strip unit and cut my diamonds out. And my inner diamonds are going to be like 7 3/4, I think is what I figured out. I'll look back, I'll do some sketching and recalculate. So I've got my groups defined, and a little bit of sharing between groups will just increase sort of the smooth, even gradient look that I'm going for on this quilt. So yeah, my 7 3/4 is the block in the quilt. So raw, it's going to have to be 8 1/4 in the middle. Some people are really thrown off by quilt math, and basically what you need to do as a rule is when you're doing your calculations, do your calculations for the block as it shows up in the quilt. Wait until the very end when all your calculations are done, and then add your 1/4 inch. Because if you're not consistent with that, you're going to lose track of, is the 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch or whatever it is, on, off, in, out, whatever. So assume you're talking about always, always, always the dimensions as it shows up in the totally finished quilt. Calculate everything through to the end, and before you do cutting instructions, that's where you add your 1/4 inch on each side seam allowance, or 1/2 inch for the whole thing. If you're using some dimensions with it in, some dimensions with it out, taking it in, putting it out, it's going to get real complicated real fast. So look at the finished, totally finished dimensions, do all your figuring, at the end, pull that out, or adjust for that one time at the end. If you enjoyed this content, please give us a like, comment, and subscribe to support more content from Longarming by Jaclyn.